Progress.
Solo, can you see just the slideshow now? Okay, perfect. Good afternoon. We'll give people maybe 1 more minute, 2 more minutes to jump on so you can get yourself settled, get a snack if you need it. A bunch of people still coming in. If you're just joining us, we're just going to take 1 more minute to let other people join. We have about 25 people that RSVP'd today. So we'll make sure that everyone.
But I would say that, I mean, obviously Sri Lankan food will be different, but there'd be many similarities because they are so close by.
I mean,
Similar things. I think.
my understanding.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's session on driving in the US. Super glad you can be here. I am Leah Zimmer. I'm the Director of International Student Scholar Affairs, and my colleague Tolu is also here managing some of the technical pieces. But we are hopeful that today's conversation will help you just understand driving in the US, how to get a driver's license, what are some maybe norms and rules that might be unfamiliar to you, and just give you some good information to get started with any plans you have to get a US driving license or a learner's permit or work with an international driving permit if you have that. We are really glad to take questions. And so I would recommend that for the presentation, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll make sure to address all of them at the end. And there will be a few moments where I'll also ask you just to put some information in the chat so I know who I am talking to about driving. But that's sort of the general overview. Like I said, for those of you who just popped in, we will look at sort of how to apply for a driver's license in the state of Indiana. What is some of the terminology and language that you need to understand for that process? We'll talk a little bit about registration and insurance, which is pretty much as important as getting that driver's license. And then thirdly, we'll talk about just general rules and norms for driving. We'll now speak mostly to driving in the Midwest because that's pretty similar, and you may find an experience driving in LA or New York City to be very different. But that's really where we're going to go today. So the first thing I want to talk about is obtaining that driver's license in Indiana. And some of the definitions that are important for you to know is that the Bureau of Motor Vehicles is the Indiana government agency that gives the driver's license, the driver's permits. We call it BMV for short. If you have lived in another state in the US, you might have heard it called DMV for Department of Motor Vehicles, or some other acronym, but here in Indiana, it is the BMV. And because we're in Indiana, I'll speak specifically to that experience. If you're up in Michigan and commuting down, then the rules and the language may be a little bit different. The second thing is the driver's license, and that's actually what allows you to drive a car or motorcycle or moving vehicle in the US. And that is different from an international driving permit that is basically a document that you could use with your home country's driving license to drive in the US for a limited period of time. So we'll talk more about those distinctions. But that driving permit, not all countries have access to that international driving permit. It is basically translating driver's licenses predominantly into English. And there are agreements between different governments that allow people to use that. And the US is a part of that agreement. The fourth thing that is not listed on here is a learner's permit. And that would allow you to be training to become a driver and to get that driver's license at some point. So if you have never had a driver's license in your home country or in the US and you are brand new to the world of driving, then you will likely start with a learner's permit to get that to move into a driver's license. And it requires some supervision, and it requires sort of a practice period, may require a class, or you could benefit from taking a driving class. So those are sort of the main definitions that we'll be working with. So what we see are 4 typical scenarios for students who are looking to drive in the US. The first is that you may have a valid unexpired driver's license from your home country and that international driving permit that I mentioned already. Those international driving permits can only be acquired in your home country. So if you're eligible to get that, if you've already entered the US and you're like, I have my home driving permit, my home driver's license, without that international driving permit, you are technically not permitted to drive in the US with that out of country license. And typically the international driving permit will only allow you to drive in for up to a year in the US. And then the expectation is that if you are here for longer than a year, that you are applying for a US-based driver's license. And I will mention this a couple of times. This is an option for driving in the US that is stated on the Indiana website, the BMV website, and it is acknowledged in a number of different states. But Indiana is made up of a lot of very small cities and a lot of small municipalities, which means that even though that the state government says that this is an acceptable driving option, a smaller city government, a small town government may not recognize it. And they may give you a ticket and they may tell you that you are driving illegally with these documents. So we would generally say, if you are in this first scenario, this first situation, we would advise you to go ahead and work to get a US driver's license, an Indiana driver's license as quickly as possible, because we have had students who have had experiences outside of South Bend and Mishawaka area, where a small town officer stopped them. Maybe they were in an accident and they got an additional ticket for not driving, not having the appropriate documents to drive with when they are in that accident or when they were stopped. So this is the first scenario. The second scenario is that you have that valid unexpired driver's license from your home country, but you do not have a driving permit. And that is an option that may certainly be your situation. The third experience is that you do not have any driver's license, you've never had a driver's license, or you have a driver's license, but it's been expired. It's no longer valid. So that's certainly an option as well. And then the fourth option is that you have already been in the US for some time and you have a driver's license from another state. And I'll be honest, that is often the easiest transition to make in terms of accessing the South Bend area in Indiana BMV to get a local license. So those are the 4 scenarios. The first one is if you do have that international driving permit with a non-US driver's license, anytime you get into a car to drive, you must be carrying both of those documents. It is just absolutely required. That non-US driver's license on its own is not sufficient to drive in the US typically. And but if you have this, then you can jump right to taking the written exams and the vision screening tests to get the Indiana driver's license, which is great news. When you're typically going to get that driver's license at the BMV, you're going to have your driving test. You're getting into a car, you're driving around with someone from the BMV, you're following all of their directions, turn left, turn right, turn left, back up here, parallel park here, and stop at the next intersection, and all of those instructions, you're following that BMV officer, their instructions. That's a part of the driving test. You're in the car behind the wheel. There's also a written exam, which we'll talk a little bit about in a second, but that's allowing you to just identify that you know all the rules of the road, right? How well do you know them? And you have to pass that written exam with a certain percentage. You can take that written exam a couple of times. If you don't pass it the first time, there's sort of a waiting period for you to study again, and then you can go back and attempt to take it again. And then the third thing that everyone has to take for the a driver's license is this vision screening, right? They just want to make sure that you can see sort of your depth perception is mostly what they're checking. Can you see that kind of blinking light in the corner? If you have color blindness, then that might be something that you report in this situation as well. But with the international driving permit and the non-US driver's license, you can actually skip that driving test, and all you need to take is the written exam and the vision screening in order to proceed with getting an Indiana driver's license. The second thing is, if you just have a non-US driver's license, you don't actually have that international driving permit, then you are going to take all three pieces of that evaluation, of those evaluations. So you will need first to get an official translation of your driver's license. And we don't provide those. Typically, you could find those with an agency. It costs about $50. We have a on our website, we have a translation agency that we don't necessarily recommend, but it's one that we know that students have used previously. But you do need a translation. And I will say in some cases, you will need that translation, even if your driver's license is in English. We have had that request come back, especially if maybe some of it is in English and some of it is not. You will want to make sure that that is all translated. And part of what they're looking for is that many driver's licenses have codes on the back, and those would need to be translated so that they can assess what have you actually been approved for? What category of driving are you actually approved for in your home country? But if you have this, you can go ahead and take that driver's license, those evaluations, and jump into those if you have evidence of a non-US driver's license and it's been translated. If you don't have any driver's license, no documentation of a driver's license, then you're going to have to start one step prior to all of those evaluations, and that is that you're going to acquire a learner's permit from the BMV. And there are instructions on their website for how to get that. I'll show you the website later so everybody goes to the right spot. But this allows you to practice for 180 days. That practice has to be done with the supervision of a licensed driver. So it does assume that you have a car, and it assumes that you have a licensed driver with you at all times. You cannot drive with that learner's permit unless there's somebody else in the car who does have a license and they're sitting literally in the front seat with you in that passenger seat. But if you don't have any license from your home country, you don't have a US license, then you will have to start with that learner's permit option. And then you have that 180 days, 6 months of practice. And then lastly, it's also a really wonderful advantage if you have a driver's license from another state in the US that is not expired, then all you have to take is the written exam and the vision screening. But you're going to bring that current driver's license with you. They will probably keep it once they have issued your new license to you. So you want to be prepared for that transition, for that test, for that vision screening. They'll generally issue it pretty quickly. They'll give you a temporary one before they mail you your actual driver's license. So those are the 4 options. When you go to the BMV, it previously in COVID times, you really needed an appointment, and now you can generally just show up unless you need a driving exam. Then you would need an appointment for that. But when you show up at the BMV, there are a number of documents that you're going to take. And you're going to take in a document that proves your identity. You will take a document that proves your lawful status in the US. You need to take a document that proves that you have a social security number, or that you have at least applied to the Social Security office and you have received a letter of ineligibility. And then you need documents proving your Indiana residency. which hopefully most of you have been here for about a month now. So you will have gotten maybe your first cell phone bill, which should have your address listed on it. Maybe you've asked the registrar for a enrollment verification that has your address on it, assuming that you reported it during roll call correctly. It could be that you've gotten your first bank account statement at this point. And so any of those documents, you're going to print them off. If you only have electronic copies, ensure that your Indiana address is printed on them, and then you'll take all of those documents to the BMV. The other thing to note about this is you can see that there's some similarities between the documents proving identity and those documents proving your lawful status. So you do want to take all of those that are really printed under proving lawful status, which includes your Form I-20 or DS-2019. And all of these things will be required when you go to apply for the learner's permit or for the driver's license. Excuse me, hold on one second. Just jump me forward. For the, where you find the BMV, and actually there's one thing I wanted to say is for those of you who are not in Indiana, then you're going to have to show that residency for whatever state that you're located in. They may also, if you're in Michigan particularly, they may require additional letters or documentation to get a driver's license in Michigan. Your driver's license is going to be tied to the state that you are residing in. The other thing I'll note for the documents proving the Social Security number, you do have to have that Social Security number card in hand before you can go to the BMV, or you need that letter of ineligibility. They are identical application processes with the Social Security Administration, and you will need to go to the Social Security Administration with that packet, that application, and then typically from start to finish, that process can take 4 or 5 weeks. So that may cause some delay, to be sure to execute that step. In some cases, I do not believe the University of Notre Dame prints your full SSN on your pay stub. If you are working elsewhere, if you're a continuing student and you're eligible to work off campus, they may print your Social Security number and you could take that pay stub. But at the University of Notre Dame, it typically is not going to be the right resource. You will need your Social Security number card or that letter of ineligibility. On our website, we have very specific instructions for how to apply for the Social Security number. So getting to the BMV, there are 2 BMVs, and I will say about 12 years ago, Indiana did not have a great reputation for the experience at the BMV. And the BMV has worked very hard to improve the experience of you, the customer, the person wanting to get their driver's license, and has worked really hard to make sure that that is the just a premier experience, that there's no confusion, that it's quick, it's efficient. And so when you walk in, typically you're going to get a number. They are going to ask you, why are you here? And then they'll assign you to an appropriate representative at the BMV. Either of these, they're both about the same distance from campus. The Mishawaka office might be a little bit closer, but your best opportunity is just take an Uber there. If you are showing up for a driving test, you do have to have a car, and that car is going to have registration and insurance already, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they're pretty close, and this is where you're going to go if you're looking to if you're a St. Joseph County resident. So once you get there, like I said, you will need an appointment for a driving test if you are required to get in the car, get behind the wheel, and show them that you understand how to operate a vehicle. The appointment is required, a car is required, and it will need to be have insurance, have evidence of insurance and registration. So if you're borrowing someone's car, you'll need those documents. Typically, they have kind of a kiosk at the front, and you're typing in why are you there? You'll get a number, and you'll go and sit. In recent days, recent months, I would say the wait is probably just 10 or 15 minutes, even when they're incredibly busy, but that can vary. So just go, be ready, be patient. You'll wait for your number to be called. You'll take up all of your documents. Sometimes when you come in, there might be somebody at the front desk and they'll ask you, hey, what are you here for today? And if you say, I have a driving test appointment, they'll put you in one direction. If you're there to take the written exam, typically you need to be there at least an hour before closing to take that written exam, and they'll tell you that at the front desk. And then you'll go and you'll meet with the agent. And if you have everything in place, you pass the written exam, you pass the vision screening, then can be a very quick process. If you're missing anything, then you basically leave, go get what they told you, what you need, come back and start the process all over again. But I will say they're great at communicating. If you just say, is this absolutely everything I will need the next time I come back? They can walk you through that step so that you don't have to make multiple trips, right? If you've missed something the first time. So what I would just appreciate kind of at this point, if you could put in the chat, I talked about those 4 different scenarios. I talked about if you have an international driving permit, if you have another US driver's license, if you have no license, if you just have a home country license. Could you put in the chat what your situation is? I'm just curious how many people already have a driver's license of any kind. If you could just put in the chat, if you have a home country license, if you have a home country license with the IDP, no license at all, or if you have a license from another state. Okay, great. So most of you are in that situation with the home country so far. Okay. Those of you who have no license, you have to take the driving test. Regardless of whether you know how to drive or not, you have to take the driving test. Typically, you only need to attend driving school if you are under, I believe it's 18. So if you are over 18 and worst case scenario, you're over 21, then you would just need to take the driving test. You don't necessarily have to go to a driving school or take driving classes. And sometimes they will also, there's some nuance around when you have to do the learner's permit as well. Okay. So if you have, someone had just asked if you have a German driver's license or just a non-US driver's license, then you will need to take the written exam, and you will need to take the, actually go back really quickly, because I think most people are in that situation. So this is going to be the most relevant for you. You're going to take the written exam, the driving exam, and the vision screening, and you also need your license to be translated. So those are the pieces for most of you that you will need to cover. The difference for those of you who don't have any driver's license is that you'll have to likely do this learner's permit piece, right, for 6 months. And the earlier you start that, the earlier you can access that, that driving experience. Okay. Thanks for sharing that. So registration and insurance. You may have noticed in the US, there is a move to insure everything. There's an option to insure and have health insurance for your pets. Your car needs insurance, your apartment. It's possible that when you leased your apartment, the rental agreement required that you have renter's insurance, or it was an option that was provided to you. You can insure just about anything in the US, and it's really essential and required that you have insurance for any vehicle that you own. And so if you decide that you're going to purchase a car, and again, this might be a little bit ways down the way, you have to purchase and pay for registration, which is going to give you that license plate, right? So you then have another fee for the license plate. You will have to have some evidence of the title. And so if you have bought a car, but you got a loan, then the bank will actually hold the title, but you want documentation of the title that you are working towards purchasing that title entirely. And the title is just who owns this car. And so if you've got a loan to pay for a car, then really the bank owns that car until you've paid off the loan. Unfortunately, even though they own it, you are responsible for registration, for title, and for paying for auto insurance. Once you have paid the car in full, then you also have that title but whoever holds that loan will give you documentation, because this process also is going to happen for the registration, license plate, and title is also going to happen at the BMV. And when you go into the kiosk, you're going to say that you're there to get register your car, to get a new license plate. All of these pieces have fees, and particularly for the registration and license plate fees and for the auto insurance, those are annual fees. So you're paying every year for that experience of having the car. If you decide, man, I'm not finding anything in Indiana, there's no cars here, the shortage here, it's just crazy. But I found one in Ohio, or I found a car in Kentucky. When you buy that car in another state, you have to pay fees in that state for purchasing it. Then when you bring it to Indiana, you're going to pay another set of fees for having that car here and having it registered and licensed in Indiana. So there are a couple of different kinds of insurance, and it does vary what you are required to have based on the state that you're in. The primary one is liability, and this should cover damage to the vehicle. This should cover some of the medical medical costs that may result, especially if you are cited as the person responsible for the collision. And so that's where this liability helps you, particularly if you are at fault. Collision experience is additional insurance that covers the cost of your vehicle. Typically, you still have to pay something. So I believe my insurance, I have a $1,500 deductible on my car. So if I'm in an accident, I need it repaired, I still have to pay $1,500 out of pocket, but then my insurance company should pay the rest of it. The comprehensive insurance will cover additional things, right? So that's going to cover if someone vandalizes your car, if your car is stolen, if an act of nature, there's a flood, a tree falls on your car, that comprehensive insurance should cover that more effectively. And hail, anything like that, winter weather, something like that, that comprehensive coverage is going to cover it. But generally, liability and collision is going to be really important, especially because medical costs can be so expensive. You want to make sure that the insurance that you're purchasing is worth it and will actually cover any medical costs from an accident. And again, we are not insurance experts at all. And so what I would say about choosing that insurance is doing your research, right? Contact 4 different companies. Every agent you talk to can only represent that company. So they can't tell you about, oh, actually, we may not be the best insurance company for you. You should go try X, Y, and Z. They are trying to sell their product. It is a product. And they want you to be convinced that they're the best option for you. And the only way that you're going to know that is to go and talk with a few different insurance companies and find out how much is the monthly fee, how much will they cover you if you're in an accident, how much in medical costs will they cover for you. If you're at fault, how much will they cover for the other person? Because if they don't cover everything, you may be responsible for those extra expenses. And how much will they cover the car once it has been in an accident? So one thing that I imagine is true in most places, but is particularly true in the US, is that as soon as you drive a car off of a car lot after you have purchased it, the value of that car drops significantly. So if you spent $15,000 on a car, you drive off, you have gotten insurance for that $15,000 car. As soon as you drive it off the lot, your car may actually only be worth $11,000 or $12,000. So if you're in an accident and you go to file a claim with your insurance company and say, hey, I'm paying you to help recoup some of these costs from this accident, and they tell you, actually, your car is only worth $12,000. And you would say, but wait a second, I paid $15,000. I still owe $15,000 on this car. How is that possible? It's because as soon as you drive that car off the lot, it's worth significantly less, particularly in the eyes of the insurance company, if they're going to help you repair it or replace it. So these are different kinds of insurance. I'll show you a website at the end for the Indiana government. website that also talks about some other questions to ask and things to consider when you are choosing car insurance. The state of Indiana cannot make recommendations for good insurance companies. The University of Notre Dame cannot make recommendations, but we can tell you kind of what kinds of questions to ask. And a lot of it is, what is the coverage if I'm in an accident for me and for the other person? What is the coverage if I'm in an accident with somebody who doesn't have insurance? How much will you cover? What is the coverage for my car if it's damaged, and how much repairs? And what would my deductible be? And depending on your deductible, that may impact how expensive your insurance is every month or annually, depending on how you decide to pay it. So one thing also to note is, how do these insurance companies set their rates? Because they do vary quite a bit. The most significant is based on age and sex. So if you are under 25 years of age, you can expect to spend quite a bit more on car insurance than somebody who is older than 25 years old. And also, generally speaking, men will be paying more for auto insurance than women, regardless of their age. Your marital status, your driving record, may impact the rate. So if you don't have a driver's record, it may be more expensive when you first sign up for insurance, and it may decrease the longer that you're here and the longer that you're driving. Things like, how often do you use your car? So if you are driving 2 hours a day for a commute, your insurance may be higher than someone who has a 7-minute commute every day. It depends on what state you live in, and even what city, like your address may impact how expensive your car insurance is going to be. And this is why, if you're talking to your friend and they're like, oh, I only pay X amount, $60 a month, and you're like, I'm paying $200 a month for insurance. All of these factors are really important to consider. No two applicant is alike in the world of insurance. And then there's other things, the type of car. I have a 17-year-old SUV that I think I pay way too much insurance for. But ultimately, if I had a 2022 car, my insurance would probably be 3 or 4 times as expensive for the same car, because they are making sure that they have their money in place in case something happens to the vehicle. Somebody asked about the driver training, like, do I need that if I don't have a permit in our driver's license in another country? You don't, to take the driving test. But it's possible that it might impact your insurance. If you have no driving record in the US and you have no education, specific education. Things like the deductible. So often you can choose, you can say, you know what, I'd rather pay more every month so that when something happens, I'm not paying a really high fee. And that's, your deductible is maybe $100, $500 is probably more realistic. Or if you're like, you know what, I have some money saved, I would rather pay a lower amount because I don't expect to get in an accident or have any trouble. I'd rather pay a lower amount every month and then pay a higher deductible if something actually happens. So that deductible would actually impact how expensive your insurance is every month or annually, because you can often choose to pay every 6 months, pay annually, or pay every month for that car insurance. And even that payment schedule might impact your rate that's set by the company. So when you are calling these different insurance companies, they're probably going to ask you a lot of questions that relate to these categories of information, because they're trying to determine what is the riskiness of having you as an insurance company, or excuse me, insurance client, and what information did they need about your car, your driving history, and how much you want to pay every month or every year. They need all that information to determine what kind of special are they going to give you. And that's why shopping around is so important, because every insurance company has their own way of calculating that. So registration and insurance are both required if you're going to get a car. Typically, you want to make sure, even if you're driving, if you don't have a car yet, that you are driving a car that is insured. So if you're borrowing a car from somebody, you want to make absolutely sure that they have insurance on that car, because the expenses would then come back to you if anything happened. It looks like Tolu's putting some answers to some of the questions in here. So that's excellent. Keep putting your questions there. We can send out some information about the cost of the driver's license. That may vary, and that may be why it's not posted on the website right now. So we can make sure to get that out to you guys. So we've talked about how to get the license. What do you need to do if you've got a car or motorcycle or any vehicle that you're going to be driving around? And it is going to be your responsibility as a part of getting that Indiana driver's license to pass that written exam. In any case, no matter what your situation is, you are going to have to take that Indiana writing exam. So you'll know and be expected to know the general rules of the road. And we thought we would just talk a little bit about the rules and some norms for driving, particularly in the US, that are good to know. I've lived internationally, and the driving norms are really different, even though the rules said one thing and maybe the rules were very similar to US driving rules. What are the norms of how people follow those rules? And I will mention a couple of times while I'm talking about this. It has been interesting since COVID began to see a number of norms that were very standard, maybe pre-COVID, that once people got back out and got back on the road, the norms seem to have shifted a little bit. So I will speak mostly to what the norms were pre-COVID, because they were certainly safer norms. I've just seen a lot more risk taking on the road lately from other drivers since COVID. And I don't know what that is. I have some ideas, but just know that you might see things that don't match what I'm going to talk about. And I do think there's been a slight shift in how people engage on the road. So generally, it's just important to know that there's going to be those rules. You're going to learn those from the written exam. But a few things that are just not done here, unless someone is just driving foolishly from a US perspective, we do not use the shoulder for any kind of driving. We don't pass people on the shoulder. The shoulder is meant for people to pull over into for safety. And really, when I talk about the shoulder, you have your lane of traffic, and then there's often a little bit of extra cement, a little extra asphalt on the right side of the road. That's the shoulder. And people will pull over there if something's wrong with their car, if they're having an issue, if there's flat tire, maybe there's a wasp in the car and they're like, oh my gosh, we've got to get out of here. They'll pull over to the shoulder. No one else should use the shoulder. Often the police will also pull people over when they want them to come over, and they'll pull them over to the shoulder. This is typically on maybe a highway or an interstate. But we don't drive on the shoulder. Typically, if you see someone doing that, they are operating outside of general cultural norms for driving, especially in the Midwest. The second thing is that we in the US generally stay pretty consistently within the lines on the road. I've lived places where it was much more common to just drive on the median of the road, on the dotted lines in the middle of the road. And in the US, you're really going to stay in your lane. And that's an expression that we use often when we say, stick to what you know. And in the US, staying in your lane, in the right lane is typically where you're going to go a little bit slower. If you're going the speed limit, stay in the right lane. If you're a little bit faster, I don't recommend that, but if you're a little bit faster, you're wanting to pass somebody, then we're using the left lane for that. We would just note that you want to make sure that you're always driving defensively. There are some places where in the world, when you're driving, you are responsible for what's in front of you. And no matter what happens behind you, you aren't responsible for it. So you can pull into the lane with someone else and they have to adjust to you. In the US, the norm is much more, you are responsible for basically everything around you, and you need to be driving defensively, not on offense, right? So you're aware and you're giving way to people around you. This is one where you may see instances where people are not driving defensively. They're just doing whatever they want, running rampant. And that's where that distinction is, especially I think after COVID. When you think about giving the right of way, if 4 cars pull up to a 4-way stop, the person on the right is always going to go first. So the person to your right should go first based on whoever was the first to approach. And then giving right of way is, that's probably the best example of that. It's really important to just always wear your seatbelt in the US, especially it's required by law if you're in the front seat, but you should just generally, a cultural norm is that you're just wearing a seatbelt no matter where you are in the car. And a lot of our cars, probably similar to your home countries, they only ding if the people in the front seat haven't locked their seatbelts, but it is an expectation that the whole car would be, and you as a driver should never begin driving until everyone has their seatbelt on. If you're driving with children, there's a whole other set of rules that we will not go over here, but just make sure that before you put a child in your car, you are sure that you have the right car seat for them and that it is properly installed. And there's lots of resources on the Indiana website to look at that. So on the regulatory signs, one of the really wonderful things about Chapter 6 in the Indiana Driving Manual, which is found on their website, they have a lot of wonderful visuals for how to understand traffic signs in Indiana, and I would say predominantly the US. They're very similar state to state, and even though they are more of a Indiana Department of Transportation ruling, for the most part, states are using the same designs. And so you have things like orange traffic signs are often like temporarily something's going on. You will see them quite a bit during the summer because there's so much road work. You can see the yellow or fluorescent signs. That's going to let you know when schools are around, right? They're going to let you know when maybe pedestrian crossing is available. It might be where students are going to be present, or if the roads are probably going to be slippery during the winter. Excuse me. And then things like brown traffic signs you're going to see when you go to a state park, right? So it's just going to be a little bit of a different traffic sign. Colors really will indicate the kind of information that sign is giving you. I imagine that's very similar for driving in your home country. But they do in Chapter 6 of the manual have a lot of great examples. One that you might see more often, I have got it highlighted up here, this buggy warning. You might see in Indiana and not in other places, not in LA, not in New York City, not in Chicago. And that's because there's a very large Amish population, very large Mennonite population here in Indiana, and they don't use electricity. They do not use cars. And so certain parts of Indiana, you'll see a lot more horses, a lot more buggies. And so these signs will let you know when to be on the lookout for those. A few other rules and norms. You should always pull over for any vehicle with a siren. So that's police, ambulance, fire truck. That's the law. You need to get out of the way. Everyone has to pull over to the sides, and it's very well respected as a rule, kind of a baseline rule. Don't try and outrun them. Don't follow them. Just pull over, let them pass, and go on your day. Another thing that we talk about orientation, because it can be pretty different here, is if you're stopped by the police, you just never get out of the car as the driver or as a passenger when you're driving. If you're in an accident, even a fender bender, it's always best to call the police, especially if you plan to call your insurance company for assistance with the repair to your car, because they will require a police report in order to consider reimbursing you. And so you can exchange that insurance information with the other driver, but you should never exchange any money. A note maybe kind of obvious is that, and there's a great question about, does pulling over an ambulance mean stopping completely? It does. So pull over, stop completely, wait for them to pass you. You don't just move to the side and drive slowly across down the road. You need to pull over, stop, wait for them to pass you. Good question. Generally, you'll see quite a bit of signs, especially when you're on the highways and interstates, that you should not be driving with your cell phone. And I think most of the states around us, especially in the Midwest, have enacted no cell phone while driving laws. Often you can still do hands-free calls, and that means you're wearing headphones or an AirPod, or it's set up on speaker. But just know that that's driving while you're on your cell phone. If you're holding your cell phone, holding your phone up, or you're in an accident while you were on the phone, that could create more problems for you, more fees, more fines, in addition to whatever damage happens to the car. And then, of course, do not drink and drive. And we really just mentioned this one because one, there is not such great public transportation in the Midwest, particularly when you're outside of Chicago or Detroit. But if you were arrested for driving while intoxicated or driving while under the influence, that could impact your visa status. And those kinds of arrests are reported up through the chain if they learn that you are an international student with an F or J visa. So you do want to just take extra precautions when driving if you've been out with friends, grabbing drinks, and you're driving home. So just make sure that you are not driving after drinking. A few other things. When you're driving, you always need to have that driver's license with you, and you should always know where your registration and insurance documents are. They are not going to care if it's on your phone. Typically, you're going to keep that in the glove compartment, and that must be with you all the time. If you are borrowing a friend's car, you want to make absolutely sure that there's registration and insurance information in the car while you're driving. Another note is to be really cognizant, especially if you decide to go into Chicago for the day, that Illinois has very different transportation rules, has a very different Department of Transportation. Michigan has very different rules around transportation. So I will highlight two. The first is when you get to Michigan, you'll notice that the speed limits are actually much higher in Michigan than they are in Indiana. And that state line is really strict, and often police will sit on the state line when you're coming back from Michigan into Indiana, and would call it a speed trap to catch people who have not slowed down after being in Michigan. But the speed limits are going to be higher in the state of Michigan than in Indiana. So that's one thing that's just different. So you have to be cognizant of where you are. A second is that if you are driving in Chicago, pedestrian traffic rules are much stricter in Chicago. They are much friendlier to pedestrians in Chicago, in the state of Illinois, than they are in Indiana, than they are in South Bend. Many more people are on bikes in the city of Chicago. And so there's bike lanes that are far more frequent. So getting out of your car, cutting off a bicyclist, making sure that you're aware of bicyclists that are around you when you're taking a right turn or a left turn is really important. It's also really important that they have far more pedestrian crossings. It's important for you to be aware of these pedestrian crossings, because as soon as someone is in a pedestrian crossing in Chicago, they have the right of way and you have to stop as the driver. And there are a lot of pedestrian crossings in Chicago. So just be aware that as you're moving between states, that there are different laws and rules that you need to be aware of. You can always just look them up and maybe Google difference between, highlight of rules for driving in Chicago, things to know before you travel there. I already mentioned that often small towns will maybe interpret the Department of Transportation rules. They may not be in a different way. They may not be aware of things like the international driving permit, and they don't have to honor it. If they give you a ticket, if they have cited you for incorrect driving, for speeding, for running a red light, for running a stop sign, then they have to, then they can really do what they want, even though the state of Indiana has said international driving permits are appropriate. The other thing that I would just say with that is in Indiana specifically, we have, there's a lot of country roads and there's a lot of school buses in town and on those country roads, and you are required, similarly with the ambulance and fire trucks, you are required to stop for a school bus and wait when they put out their stop sign on the side of the bus. You cannot say, oh, the students are getting off on the other side of the bus, I'm going to sneak by. Once that school bus stops and has the stop sign up, you must stop and you must wait until they have pulled the stop sign back. And you'll see signs that kind of let you know where school zones are, but that is true no matter where you are. And while you're driving, is everyone has to stop for the school bus. That stop sign comes out, everyone's subject to that rule, everybody waits until it's pulled back. And then the joy of driving in Indiana and Michigan in the winter is just remember, especially for that very first time, I think every year, the very first time that we have snow or icy roads, all of us forget how to drive in the snow. And even though we've done it for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, that very first snowy day that we pull out of our cars is just madness. So drive with care, be patient, recognize that you can't always see ice on the roads, and it may be there. And so just no need to get in a rush anywhere when it's snowing, when it's icy. Just drive safely, go slower, turn your lights on, because it really is going to get very complicated very quickly with that bad weather. So if you have any questions or anything further, on our website, we have a whole section on driving in the US, but then we also have the Indiana government BMV site. Here, they really have almost everything that you need to facilitate getting a license, understanding the rules of the road in Indiana, which are 90% similar to other states. There's always that 10% that's different, and give you a sense of the what is required in terms of registration, insurance, all of that, for getting a driver's license. And I will pause now before I show you the last resource and just see if anybody else has any other questions that they would like to have addressed. Someone asked, are there different speed limits in different states? Sometimes they are. Often it will be posted and then it won't be posted again for a mile or two. So you do want to be paying attention. If you're using something appropriately, like Google Maps, to get to your destination, occasionally it will also tell you what the speed limit is there, but you're looking for those white speed limit signs. In Michigan, especially, it isn't helpful to follow the lead of the drivers around you, because if the speed limit is 70, often Michigan drivers will go 80, and you might be the one that's stopped for that. So Obed, you do not necessarily have to own the car that you take for the driving test, but sometimes the owner of the car does need to be there. You will have to have evidence of registration and insurance before they will allow you to go out with that car. Oh, wait, one more second. If you already have a translated non-US driver's license, then you can just go to take the written exam at the BMV. Generally, you can just show up for that. It's the driving test that has needed the appointment. You might have to wait a little bit if there's other people there taking the test. And but just know that you should be able to just go in and connect with them, show them your documents, and then let them know that you're there to take the test. Again, show up at least an hour before closing time for the BMV. And they have kind of funny schedules. I think it's Mondays that they aren't open, and then they're only open half a day on Friday. So just know that that will be, there'll be some variation there. And I was just going to put the driver's manual link into the chat for everybody, because it's all online. And Columbian, I think there is actually a separate, I'm going to take 2 seconds to look and see. We should have looked up that pricing. The other thing to note, and I should have mentioned this, is that when you get a driver's license at the BMV, the end date, the expiration date on your driver's license is actually the end date on your I-20. And so if you were to get a program extension, if you're a grad student and you get a program extension, or when you go to apply for OPT, you will actually most likely have to apply for another driver's license at that point. So pay attention to that expiration date. Let me just confirm about the appointments, and we'll see if we can confirm the pricing too. I'll put that in the chat, but otherwise I'll look up those two things, how much it is, and whether you need the appointment for the written test, just to confirm, But otherwise, thanks so much for joining us today. We'll stay on for a few minutes if people have any other questions. Oh, thank you for the person who confirmed the written test. I was pretty sure that one doesn't require the appointment. I believe that the driver's license is under $20 still, and that actually then can be a real ID, which you can use to fly with. And I believe that that also includes the cost of the test. So it's not super expensive. The fees that really rack up are your registration for your car, your title, the license plate, and your insurance. But actually getting the driver's license is pretty accessible. Okay, any other questions? Angela, I think if you were to look up just driving schools, there's a couple of driving schools here in the area that they can set you up. And typically you do not need a car to go to a driving school and take lessons. And the costs can run, I think I haven't checked for probably 5 or 6 years, but it can run like $200 to $600 depending on how many lessons you have in the particular school. Oh, thank you, Tolu, for the car registration fees. Well, it looks like there aren't any more questions, you guys.